And okay. Hey Jabbers, welcome back to another episode. Today we are joined by Emily Foster, and we're so excited because we're going to be talking about client archetypes. And I think Emily is the perfect person to talk about this. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about our guest, Emily, today. She is the creative force behind Emily Foster Creative, a Portland based brand and web design studio helping wedding pros, photographers, and other creatives step into strategic, standout branding that actually books clients. We all want that. With over 7 years in design and strategy, Emily blends savvy marketing and aesthetic brilliance, crafting custom brands and SEO friendly website that feel as real and magnetic as the people behind them. She's been featured on industry stages and podcasts, served creatives around the globe, and still finds time for pals books, rom-com marathons, and pinning wedding inspo on Pinterest. Plus, she's a newlywed who truly gets the world of weddings from both sides of the aisle. Get ready to dive into some branding wisdom, strategic design insight, and how to elevate your creative business from nice to next level. Emily, we are so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. That makes me sound so good, that intro.
Because you are.
I
I
feel like
love hearing all the
everyone
fun facts.
loves hearing their bio read. It like makes them feel like really good about themselves, which I love.
Sometimes I forget things about myself. I'm like, oh yeah.
I do like to do that hobby.
Yeah.
Amazing. Emily, so we're so excited to have you. And today I know Gabby mentioned we're talking about client archetype. So tell us a little bit more, like, what does that actually mean? How is that different from just having like a niche audience or an ideal client avatar? Break that down for our listeners on what that actually means.
Yeah. So I would say like your niche is basically the broader kind of audience that you're choosing, right? Like it's like if you're a wedding planner in Nashville, it's like couples in Nashville who are looking for like a fun creative experience or something like that. But then your ideal client is probably what most people know that from like their coaching programs and things like that, where you're understanding like the demographics of your client, like how much money are they willing to spend on their wedding? How much money do they make? How old are they? Is this like their first wedding or their second wedding? And then a client archetype, I think, dives deeper. So I always say it's the intersection of those demographics and then also psychographics. So those are like the emotional things that your ideal client is thinking of. So it's like beliefs, values, it's the way that they spend money because we all spend money with emotion, whether we share it or not. And it's like what they value about their wedding. So it's not just the fact that they are willing to spend a lot on a certain vendor type, but it's like the other values that they have around their wedding as well. Because some people will spend for full service planning, but they would go really budget on florals or on photography and vice versa. So that's like the broader thing. And then the other part of this Venn diagram, along with psychographics and demographics, is the client journey of how they're thinking about the wedding planning process or event planning too, just like for broader event planners. And then where they're finding you in that process and like what they're experiencing during that buying process.
And Emily, what I guess, I mean, for a lot of people, business owners are kind of like have an idea, right, of what their ideal client is, but why would you say the value of like sitting down and actually coming up with like all of those things is really important for us as a business owner?
I think that business and especially dealing with people and an emotional industry isn't clean cut where we can just say, oh, yes, all couples in my area making this amount of money will behave this way in the sales process or engage this way with my marketing. So diving deeper and knowing like more details, like your client archetype allows you to really see the general audience as humans and figure out like emotionally what's going to get them to buy. So it's number one, like knowing more about them and being able to connect with them on a more emotional level. And then it's also having more context to help you develop your marketing. And I think a really good analogy for this is like you've probably heard the examples of like, oh, you should know if your ideal client shops at Target and likes to go to Starbucks. And it's like, that's great. But the client archetype model tells you like why do they shop at Target and why do they go to Starbucks? Like, what is it that makes them want to buy like commercialized, overpriced coffee and buy home goods that they may or may not need? Is it like, do they go to Target to get away? Or are they going there because they really care about home decor and they are always thinking about like how to upgrade their space and things like that? Like, there's so many reasons why people make an investment. And that is the client archetype is understanding, like, kind of back to the full service planning aspect, like, what emotionally do they see in that investment? Like, why would they spend extra money on a certain type of service?
That's really interesting because Kari and I have both taken a sales class with Maria Bayer, and we've mentioned this in past episodes, but she reminds us that we're all selling the same package. We're all selling the same services if you're really breaking it down line by line. But what makes us different is what are the emotional benefits that we're selling? And this is a really good reminder that yes, we could all target a bride that shops at Target. If I didn't mean to say it Target and Target, but like we can all aim to book a client that shops at Target. But what makes us different is the reason behind why are you going to Target type of thing. Like, do you connect with them because, like you said, you're passionate about home decor and it's important that your wedding also reflects that, or whatever the case may be. But the emotional benefit is really, really the key here, because that's how you're going to differentiate yourself from other planners, photographers, bakers, whatever it is. Because at the end of the day, we're all selling the same thing.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I love Maria Bayer, by the way, and I'm in IS too, actually. So,
Nice.
yeah, so I love that she talks about that in the sales process. And I think it's so funny, like, because two things that come up in my strategy calls with clients are like that people kind of hold back on, I think, at first is when I ask them, I try to phrase it as ideal client to kind of get started. Like, I'll like, can you tell me more about your ideal client? And we also talk about different client types, like your primary client and your secondary client. And some of my clients get like really like it's almost like they put like tape over their mouth. They're like, well, they live in Austin and they are looking for a wedding planner. And it's like, yeah, and so are the clients of all the other 200 wedding planners in the city. And so we usually have to dive deeper into that. And then the other one is competitors, which I think does play a factor into this, where I'll ask people like, who are your competitors? And they'll say, oh, I'm community over competition. That doesn't really matter. Or they're my friends. Like, I've even had some clients ask me like, why are you going to reach out to them? Which is always the funniest to me because I'm like, no, you're like my client that I'm working with. But I think also having an awareness of that, like you need to know, even if you're all selling the same service and you have similar pricing, which most people don't actually have that similar of pricing, like especially in bigger markets, it's important to know like the emotional benefits that you're each offering. And that's why we have that conversation along with ideal clients about competitors.
I think it's something Gabby and I talk about often too is like we are not our ideal clients. And so I think that is a challenge for a lot of people of like getting out of your own brain of like why you wouldn't spend this kind of money on a wedding or like that certain aspect. And so it's really like putting your own beliefs aside to be like, who is my ideal client because I might not be that person. And I think sometimes I struggle with that of like, well, why would they spend that kind of money? I wouldn't spend that kind of money, but it's so different for the clients that you're serving.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think I know a lot of wedding vendors that just kind of don't want weddings, period. I think it's kind of the burnout of being at so many weddings that you're like, I'm just gonna go to Norway and elope, which is great. But then I think because I do this with my own career, like we know how to do what we offer. So it's like, why would we spend thousands of dollars on paying someone else to do it? But I think that can also be sometimes a clue about your ideal client is that they don't know how to do it, but they want it done just as well as you would. Like if I didn't know how to do branding and website design, I would definitely pay an expert to do it because it's like I care about it so much that I wouldn't have it not done well for my own business. And I think that you could always like flip it in that way for whatever you do in the wedding industry of like if you're a baker, like you wouldn't and you wanted to have a wedding and you wanted to have a cake, like you wouldn't just hire someone down the street who's like this is like their second cake they've ever baked. Like you would probably do it yourself. And if you didn't have the skills, then you would go out and find someone to do it. And so I think thinking about it in that way, like the value that we actually offer and the skill and the time that we're bringing to the table, for clients is important. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's also hard when we talk about luxury, I think, of I can't even remember the podcast now, but I was listening to a wedding industry podcast years ago. And they were talking about how if you want to be a luxury vendor, you have to kind of spend some time in like the luxury world to really immerse yourself in what your clients care about and like understand like these nuances because like I never care about champagne type or caviar or anything like
Right.
that. So it's hard to get
That's
our heads
true.
wrapped around
That's
that.
such a great point. Yeah.
Well, and I remember this conversation happening when we a while back had talked about pricing. And there was, this was years ago that people were really starting to think about the percentage pricing in the luxury market. And vendors, wedding pros were nervous because they're like, well, my clients like to know upfront what the flat fee is going to be. What if like it goes up from there? But and I think it was even Maria was maybe talking about this, but whoever it was like, you have to understand the luxury market is used to this pricing. This is what they understand. They
Mhm.
know that depending on the service provided, there will be kind of a minimum. But then if you add on an extra day of the wedding or you add on transportation coordination or whatever it is, that will grow. And therefore, you will need to, as the planner, let's say, you will need to be paid more for that total experience. So I think you're right, is like you do have to experience the luxury market to some extent in order to speak their language and understand, how they work. You can't, it's very hard to be a DIY person in your real life and then try to sell luxury, services.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we just got a flooring project done and we were kind of on, a set budget for that. It already felt like a luxury that we were paying someone else, period, to do it. But while they were here, one of the guys was sharing like a $1.5 million project that they've been working on for another house where there's like literally lighting behind the shower. And it got me thinking about this and I was like, I bet that guy is not asking them about like we got leveling added to the cost. And I was like, what's the extra estimate going to be? Like, are you sure it's not going to be more than this? And it's like that guy's probably just like, oh, sure, like do that extra
Get it
thing. Like we're
done.
already this far in anyway. And that's
Yeah.
how I think the wealthy think is like you don't just go on vacation and not book the extra excursion or pay extra
Mm.
for the all-inclusive or like extra add-ons. You're like, I'm already here and I already have the money for this. So like let's just go all out.
So
Not that they
true.
are frivolously spending on everything. I think everyone still
Yeah.
has their priorities. Yeah.
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 Okay, Emily, what would you say is the biggest misconception you see wedding pros that they have about choosing their ideal client? Like the Pinterest perfect versus someone who actually pays on time versus the wealthy. Like, what's the biggest misconception there?
Yeah, I honestly think, assuming that because they have a big wedding budget, that they have the budget for your service.
Fair.
And this was something that I experienced on like the client side. Like we got married in 2022, and I think it's kind of changed since then. But back then it was like you could just go on Pinterest and see all these charts for exactly how much you should spend on each vendor in your wedding. And I, as a client, was like kind of turned off and offended of it because I'm like, what do you mean you can only spend 10% of your budget on photography? Like that was something that I didn't understand. And I was like doing the math. I'm like, that does not work out for our budget. Like it's going to have to be like 15, 20% in our case. And so I think that like I experience this on strategy calls a lot and like in inquiries where people are like, well, I want to work with people who have big budgets. And it's like, that's not your ideal client because you have to really understand like, why do they value spending more on your service despite having a lot of money? Like, it's not like just because they have even six figures to spend on a wedding that they're going to value wedding planning or photography or a cake or anything like that. It's like, what is the meaning behind your service? And I think that's why you have to dive deeper than just like age and income and wedding budget to really understand. And also, like when you set an ideal client based on like, I want to work with people who make this amount of money and have this wedding budget, you're not considering all the nuances of those different clients where we know there are like 23-year-old couples getting married, and the mom and dad are like totally in charge of that budget. And they may even, like, the couple themselves may be at the point where they're making a lot. Like, they are in law school, or I guess you're not really making a law in law school, but
Not
like
yet.
they're working in tech, but their parents are still funding, and that's a totally different type of client than like a 35-year-old couple who both make money and they've saved their entire like last 10 years for this wedding, and they're going to probably be a little bit more careful with how they spend, and they may not have those other stakeholders in the process too.
I feel like when I have clients who parents are contributing, I feel sometimes like I get whiplash because like the parents have a lot of money and like, the couple getting married is like, we have some money, but then like there's different priorities. And so I'm like, okay, what does mom want? And like, what is she willing to pay for? And I feel like sometimes I'm being like tossed around because they have different priorities, but also like if mom and dad are paying for it and it's important to them, like, different things happen. So sometimes I feel like it's tricky to navigate that when there's multiple parties involved.
Yeah, I know it can be really funny. I feel like it's probably like talking to like a person with like two heads, like of like which opinion do I go with? And then
Yeah.
like, the nuance, like you saying that reminded me of randomly my chiropractor who got married later in life. I think she got married at like 38, and she was sharing like back when I was wedding dress shopping. She's like, I could get whatever I want, my because my dad was paying for everything. And so she was like an older bride whose dad was still paying for everything, but their dynamic was like he had the money. I think she was an only child or something too. And so it was like, you can just do whatever you want. Like, yeah, I'm funding the wedding, but you can make the decisions. And then I think you do run into those, especially the mothers of the bride that are like, this is my wedding. Like, I'm spending the
Yeah.
money on the wedding. And so I get to make the decisions for my daughter and son-in-law.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I do love those clients where they're like, yeah, I can do whatever I want. And you kind
Yeah.
of feel like the budget's unlimited.
Yeah, that's like if that would be everyone's client archetype, right?
Yeah,
If you could
exactly.
do everything you want and no budget.
Emily, so a lot of us have been in the industry for a while, and I think, when we started, we did this, we figured out our ideal client, and obviously over the years it changes, especially with trends in the wedding industry, and everyone raises their prices the more experience they get. And I'm curious, like if a lot of people start to outgrow their client archetype that they originally built, like how does someone go about finding that new archetype, and what are some red flags that might be an indication for people that like, oh, I might have outgrown this client archetype?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is self-reflection, and that's where it's like good to have like that steady, like almost like a CEO week or time during the year where you're like reanalyzing things. I feel like when you're thinking about upping your pricing, that's a great time to evaluate like who is a client that we're trying to target with this new pricing. And like first reflecting on the red flags of like maybe people not being a good fit. So I think number one is that you like just don't enjoy working with your clients anymore. We see that a lot with clients that are coming in for rebrands because they're like, oh, I'm making the money that I want and I'm booked out, but it's like I just don't really enjoy these couples anymore. And like just the funny nuances that I hear from clients too behind the scenes that they're like, if I have one more couple like this, like they like bring money into the door and they're great and I do enjoy them as people, but they're also just like annoying clients. So I think when you start to feel that tension of like, yeah, it's been great, but I'm kind of ready for new pastures, then I think that is a sign that there's a red flag. Scope creep and any kind of like boundary crossing when it's happening steadily multiple times. And the caveat is like when it's not because of like your sales or systems processes. Like sometimes we do just kind of need to like lock in some details around our business and it doesn't really have anything to do with our brand. But I think there's a level of trust and expectations that you set during the marketing process before you even get into the sales process. Like there's kind of a voice that you put out there to your clients. And so if you find that your current clients are constantly asking for more or trying to get discounts or not respecting your time and like your boundaries and things like that, and it's not something that you could do differently in your systems, then I think that's a red flag. And then another one, it's like not necessarily a red flag, but I think it's a hindrance to growth. And I think Gabby and I know this well since we're in the abundance group together, but it's like when you're ready to scale past a certain point, and thinking about like, is that current client that you have really what's going to get you to the point where you can either book more volume or book like higher end clients and build a team? Because sometimes we can love exactly where we are with the clients, but it's like if they're not sustaining the kind of business that you want and the kind of team that you want, then that's a sign that something needs to change.
Mhm.
So that's like the red flags. And then getting into building the new client archetype, I think it can be market research of having conversations with people about like why they booked or didn't book with you, thinking about like that self-reflection time, like who did you enjoy working with the most, and thinking about why. And I think there's two aspects that you could write down with this of like the logistics of why you liked working with them, like the style and the budget that they had, and like how the project went as a whole. But then also thinking about that person's personality, like how they engage with you on calls and how they communicate with you, and like what felt good about that. Like an example for mine is one of my client archetypes is that I really love working with people who like are just okay with handing over the reins and like they just want to trust an expert with their brand and website. I'm the kind of person that I would probably be very detail oriented during the process and have a lot of creative feedback. But I've kind of learned over time, like I can work with people that are like that, but I'm not looking to work with the people consistently that are going to have 75
Yeah.
pieces of feedback on every single round of the project. So like thinking about that kind of personality type, when like are they like warm and fuzzy or are they like more direct and to the point, like all of those kinds of details and analyzing like is that the same as who you have now? And I think that's also where it's great to have industry friends too and have conversations about like, hey, I noticed you said that you kind of are working with these kinds of clients. Have you always done that? Like, what did you do to start working with those
Mhm.
clients? And have authentic conversations about the reality of what that looks like to change your client archetype because your marketing and your sales and your systems will have to change inevitably, especially if you're scaling up. For example, like if you're going to go from like premium to luxury in the industry, then that does come with some sacrifices.
Well, this is maybe actually a perfect segue to my next question. Um, can you have, or is there a scenario where you could have multiple client archetypes? And what came to mind right away is when you said growing the team. So I'm going through this right now where my client archetype, which on a surface level was someone who at the a few years ago was a glamping type of adventurous client, but I've realized that I actually don't like camping anymore. And I don't want to do that. So I've changed my client archetype to someone that's a little more enjoying the bougie life and wants more experiential, but high hospitality, like high touch. It can be multiple day weddings, but we're not getting that dirty anymore. Like, So, however, my team, I am okay changing their client archetype to be something that's more um the budgets are maybe a little bit lower. And again, I know I'm talking to surface level stuff, like not so deep emotional, but on the surface level, local more to Nashville, less destination, that kind of stuff. So I see them as two very different types. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think that one hack for finding that ideally is trying to find the commonality between those types so that you have one message like for your website if you're not going to build like separate pages and separate websites for your clients. I think for yours, like the commonality is that they want like an experiential kind of experience, no matter the budget. Like they want to like get outside or like get out, like have some kind of adventure, but it doesn't necessarily mean being dirty for like the higher end clients. So I think that's a commonality, but then you would still divide the client archetypes and you could definitely have one that like your team is booking for the most part, and then one that like you're working the weddings or like some team members are taking on those different kinds of weddings.
Yeah.
The other type that I talk about with clients is like you should have a different client archetype for every single service. So that's another way to divide it
Oh.
too, where you could scale your packages so that like package one, like the lowest one, is, and it doesn't have to be coordination because I feel like as planners we jump to like, oh, you have to have coordination, partial, and full service planning, but it could be divided in different ways where it could be like, I don't know, like 2 day weekend, like week support or something like that. So having a different client archetype for each service and why they care about that. And then the other aspect too in your marketing is like targeting the highest package client and then knowing that some of those people that are booking the lower package like are a different client archetype, but if they had the budget, then they would aspire to be like that highest archetype.
Yeah. Oh, that's
That,
brilliant, actually.
yeah, I never really thought about that, like having different for each service. I guess that is a great segue into this next question then, because for a lot of people, how is like the client archetype showing up before the inquiry even hits our inbox, right? Is it marketing, website copy, how you're showing up on social media? I guess how do you make that come across, especially if you do have like multiple archetypes for different services?
Yeah, so it shows up where you are, number one, like because if you have a certain client archetype, you may not even need to spend time on a certain marketing platform, like TikTok, for example. Like you need to know, like, is your person on TikTok? Are they on the Knot, or wedding? I guess the Knot and Wedding Wire. Like, so you have to consider like what listings and what social media platforms are you showing up on. Everyone should have a brand and website, so that definitely is something that's going to be showcased in your brand and website of like speaking to that client. And one way I love to do this is reading Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller and thinking about the storytelling that you're using on your website and like the value that you're communicating to your client. So knowing the values that they care about makes that a lot easier to like write the copy on your website. And then you can take that and use that across all of the platforms, like from captions to listing bios and all of that to like have taglines and other communication pieces that get to the heart of the value that you offer for those client archetypes. And then I think if you have like very different client archetypes, you can think about a few different strategies. So one is that you can market to all. You may have to do like more volume marketing, or you may have to kind of select like certain platforms will communicate more of this to a client. And I see that a lot where like some vendors get really high-end referrals. So they're always working with like luxury clients because of referrals, but then they attract like almost like lower budget clients on marketing platforms, and that's like the kind of clients that they give to their team. So that kind of method can work well. Or like what I mentioned earlier, like targeting the client archetype that like is that third high, and I use three packages because I feel like that's a good way to tier your services, but no matter how many you have, like it's targeting that highest like aspirational client archetype and speaking to them all the time and the value that you offer to that kind of client, knowing that other people who invest in you will care about those same things to a certain extent, but they may not be able to make it all happen.
Mhm.
Like one example is like with our brand and website services, we have something called the all-inclusive experience where we do everything for your website. But the service is 10 to 15K, which I realize doesn't work for a lot of wedding vendors. But I have clients who book our $3,500 project and they are looking for all of those services, but they're okay with doing some more things themselves to get the end result. Like, because all of our services give you the same end result. It's more about like the experience getting there is different. I had a coach explain this really well to me, like my first year in business, of like, we're all buying a plane ticket, but it's like, what do you want your plane experience to be like while getting to that destination?
Yeah.
So, thinking of like all your clients want the same destination and the same experience, like that end result. But what is that experience going to look like? And
Mm.
usually for most vendors, that's kind of how a lot of people tier their packages. It's like
Hmm.
the level of support or the level of like white glove experience that you're getting during that process.
That's a great analogy. I like
Yeah.
that. Like, do you want to fly first class with champagne or do you want to be on Spirit Airlines?
Yeah. Yeah. And remembering, like, if you're going to Paris, they're both still great. Like, there's not really a
Yeah,
wrong place. Like, you're still going to have the wedding. It's still going to be,
totally.
yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
true.
I
I
love
love
that.
that. Okay, let's speak a little bit to the skeptics about client archetypes in the sense that I know some people out there are feeling like this will narrow their pool of clients and they're just worried about maybe pigeonholing themselves. What would you say to people that are afraid that it's going to turn too many people away?
Yeah, I would say there is a reality when you do a rebrand, when you change your client archetypes and like change up your marketing, like you will see fewer inquiries in general, because there's like that shifting and that changing time. So like that's very real. And I think that's true like anytime you change pretty much anything on your website, or like anything with your marketing, like if you change the cadence with which you're doing it, and the amount and volume and everything. And I think getting comfortable with that change helps. But then thinking about the end result of like really being seen as an expert in what you do is going to allow you to like exponentially raise your prices. It's going to make everything so much like happier and more joyful and more comfortable in the process as well. And I can like speak from experience, like I'm year 5 in business and I niched down in the wedding industry my first year of business. And I wanted to work with everyone. We kind of still do work with other people who aren't in the wedding industry, but it's like at the time I like was trying to think of this really broad tagline of like, how do I say that I want to work with like photographers and wedding pros, but also like candle makers and Etsy businesses. And like I just wanted to work with anyone who kind of like did something creative. And it just wasn't working. And I continue to have people say like you need to niche down, you need to get more specific about your client archetype. And now I'm getting to the point where I have many clients book me because they inquired with other designers who aren't niched in the wedding industry. So it's like, yes, I'm not attracting e-commerce businesses and things like that on the regular. We actually have one right now that we're working with that was a referral. So sometimes you will have clients inquiring that aren't necessarily that niche that you're working with, which is exciting. But you kind of have to decide like, do you want the opportunity to be seen as the expert, like kind of like the big fish in the small pond, or do you want to continue to kind of be seen as like the small fish in the bigger pond?
I mean, we've talked about this, Carrie, for the podcast. Like for when we first
Yeah.
started, we were like, we want to do kind of business tips for creatives, which is why we called it just Another Biz Podcast. But then we started thinking like, but what we're really good at is the wedding industry. Like that is what we know. We know the ins and outs, business, on-site stuff, vendor stuff. Like that's what we know. It's the wedding industry. And like, yes, does that mean our reach is going to be smaller? Sure, but our listeners are way more active, and the feedback it's more every episode is more relevant to that audience. So I think you're right. And I remember someone telling me years ago about my website and they said, I want it to attract the right people and I more importantly want it to repel the wrong people. And I've remembered that my whole career because I was like, yes, I don't like super glam ballroom brides is not what I feel that I'm the best at. And I can't give them the best service in that sense.
Mhm.
So if they land on my website and right now it's still very adventurous and stuff like that, they're going to see that and they're going to be like, hell no. And that's perfect because we're probably not the best fit. So I really value that. I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's just so much easier to repel them before you have a conversation versus
Yeah.
like we can all get through a couple discouraging sales calls, but when that becomes the regular thing, it's like that's just not how you want to run business. And that's like still not even as bad as like when you sign a non-ideal client. And then like if you have to give a
Painful.
refund or you have to like struggle through like teeth and nails like to the end. And the other thing I was going to mention too is problem solving. Like when you are an expert in a niche, it makes you a better problem solver and you know how to like answer questions easier, put out fires, like prevent the fires, all of that. And that's very similar to like the medical industry where like you wouldn't go to like a dermatologist to ask them about like women's health or something like that.
Right. Good point.
Like it's better to go to the specialist. And I think we recognize that as a society. Like people do that with cars, they do it with like dental work, medical work, law. Like you wouldn't go to a divorce lawyer for like copyright infringement or something. So I think that sets you up for success. I think a lot of people in the industry, like kind of on that law example, a lot of vendors are like, yeah, I'm a wedding planner or I'm a wedding photographer. But you don't see lawyers saying, I'm a lawyer, like, and I just serve
Yeah.
everyone who needs any legal support because that just wouldn't work out. So I think that gives you a new confidence, which can also help back your pricing and your marketing in the long term too.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. I know, Emily, I kind of spoke to like our lived experience and our own like hang up, so to speak, of like what we wouldn't spend money on or what we would. And so I'm curious, like, what role does like a lived experience play in us shaping our client archetypes? And also, how do we avoid projecting ourselves? Because I think it's easy to say, okay, I know I wouldn't pay for that, so I'm just gonna like take my own thoughts and feelings out of it. But it's so hard when like we mentioned money is a really emotional thing for all of us, no matter how much money we have and how we spend it. And so I think it's a discipline to kind of take our own lived experience out of creating our client archetype. But how would you share that we go about that to like remove ourselves from that?
Yeah, I think practicing like putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And like an example that came to mind was like when we talk about like I'm not into football at all. And which is funny because I went to like a really popular like I went to University of Oregon, which is like the Ducks school. And so like there's tons of people around me into football. But like when Taylor Swift got engaged, that was like my Super Bowl, like my like game that I had to get updates on. And I think a lot of people can relate to like you have something that you're like paying attention to and that you would like place a lot of value on. So it's like I can empathize like with someone who cares so much about football and like you can't miss that game. Like you need to know everything about it. Like you have to sit down and be present for the entire Super Bowl and kind of thing like that. So I think making like helping yourself to see something that's valuable to you, like something that you would spend extra money on, because I think everyone, even the most frugal people, like they do have something that they would spend extra money on or something that they're saving for or that like brings them happiness. And trying to like kind of relate that to like that's what this is for your client. So that's one thing that can help. I think talking with people too, like maybe having a couple friends that also see the importance in it can be helpful of like understanding like the value that they see and like kind of internalizing that. And then I think like another thing is just like thinking of yourself as a guide of like you're trying to get your client to the end result. You're not necessarily trying to convince them either way of like making a decision. Like you just know that this is important to them and like whatever little details are going to get them that end result that's important.
Mm.
And I think that is a good way to like think of like we want like the end result of happiness basically. And like
Yeah.
let's like think about like how that's going to get you there. Like kind of back to the plane example where it's like some people like first class because of the extra leg room. Some people want it because of like the free champagne. And it's like thinking about like why does that matter to them, and then just like doing everything in your power to get them that.
Mhm.
Yeah, do you guys have examples of like what things are not important to you that you would like you're like, oh, I would never spend money on that?
Oh, that's a great question.
Ooh, putting us on the spot, Emily.
I know.
Um, well, okay, I will say this because I was at a WIPA event this week and the speaker was talking about, and she is like a high-end ultra luxury planner, but is very bold and creative and knows exactly who are her ideal client and gives no F's about anything else. Like she's very out there and I loved her energy. But one thing she said, unless there are rectangular tables or an overhead drone shot, do not waste time on straightening chairs. And at first, everyone was like, what? You're getting multi-million dollar weddings and you don't have an assistant dedicated to straightening chairs. She's like, absolutely not. Nobody's going to notice it. At rounds, we're talking about rounds specifically. And again, if there's no drone shot, she's like, sure, if there's a rectangular table and I know there's going to be a photo down, that way, I would expect my photographer to let me know they're going to take that shot and I'll have an assistant follow and straighten chairs on that one. But otherwise, do not be wasting your time doing that. And I thought that was really interesting because there was a planner in the room who is a very, very type A planner, and she will over straighten chairs. And she raised her hand and she's like, well, that's literally how I sell myself to couples, like that I am so type A that I will go around and like measure. We've all seen those videos of that planner measuring every single little thing on the tables. And so anyway, this other planner was like, you do you if that's what sells your couples, but I'm there for the experience. I know that nobody will notice that in the end. So this doesn't answer your question per se, but I found that to be really interesting that I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe, these decisions is not where I'm going to build my hospitality experience. It's not about how straight the chairs are. That's not what people are going to care about, but rather, are they greeted with a cocktail or are they greeted with a warm drink if it's a winter wedding? Like that stuff for
Yeah.
me is really,
Yep.
really important.
That's so true. Yeah, that made me think too. Like another tip is if you had $1 million, like for your wedding, like who wouldn't spend it on some of these things? Like, because I think it's also easy for us to think like, oh, I would never spend money on that. And like we're often thinking about our bank accounts, our capabilities. But like if I had $1 million, I wouldn't care if my planner straightened the chairs. And that's like the kind of client that I would probably want to work with as a planner is like the experience focused clients. Instead, I would be like, I don't know, getting fireworks, like having like it
Right.
would be like a wedding where you have to take a boat to get to this like island at the wedding, like spending money on those things. So I think knowing your ideal, like your client archetype, that's why it's different than an ideal client is like diving even deeper
Yeah.
into those things. Like two clients could have the exact same budget and they
Hmm.
could want like this quote unquote luxury experience, but they're looking for a type A planner or they're looking for an experience focused planner or
Well,
they're
and
looking
like,
for both. Like,
right. And nobody's
yeah.
going to be like, I loved Emily's wedding. Her chairs were so straight.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, and that like also is like, yeah, knowing like their dynamics of like, do
Yeah.
their parents maybe care about that? Like, I wish I could give credit to this podcast because I do not remember, but it's the one that I was talking about where they were like, go like try some caviar and like taste champagne and like get immerse yourself in luxury. But they were talking about like three ultra luxury client types. And this was like a few years ago. So maybe it's changed, but they were talking about like the celebrity client. And they're like the client that cares about like they're the athletes and the actors that like they want the brand names. They're, spending high six figures to seven figures on their wedding. And they care about like the reputation, how everything looks. And that may be like the straight chair clients, but they really like they want things that look expensive and flashy and then kind of experience is a part, but like not maybe the biggest thing. And then there's like the Silicon Valley clients that are like they want the high-end experience. They're spending more money on the catering and the alcohol. Like
Ooh,
they
I
want
want
all of
them.
their friends and colleagues to have like a blast and like the biggest party of their
Yes.
life. But they might not be buying like the highest end label of like dress or something like that. And they might be like in some ways cutting costs there, like not doing like the most excessive luxury thing. And then there was the old money, like those might be the parents paying for the wedding. And like I see those as the chair straighteners,
Yeah, I don't
stereotypically.
want that. I want
Yeah,
the
where it's
Silicon
like,
Valley. I'm going to have a little one-on-one conversation with ChatGPT about the Silicon Valley archetype group here.
yeah,
Ooh.
yeah. And I wish if someone's listening to this from that podcast, because I haven't listened to it in a long time, so I don't remember what it was called, but I think it was also hosted by like two women and they were like just talking about this. And I found that so interesting because they were like the old money people too are planning like kind of a business event. Like oftentimes
Yeah.
it's like, the dads might be in business together or like this is like basically a unity kind of event
And
versus,
they always invite friends, like the parents always invite friends, which
yeah,
I don't in my the weddings that I do like it's just family and then the couple's friends, but not
Mm.
parent friends.
right. Yeah. And so I think that like that knowing that client archetype changes things too. And that's like ultra luxury. So I'm sure you could like I feel like that's like the top like seven-figure weddings. So if you kind of scaled it back, there's probably more kind of pockets. But I think that's helpful to know the values of like, is this like, are they building up their reputation with the wedding or are they just like living the experience of a lifetime? Like, and that's another thing is like, is their wedding kind of one of many luxury events that they're planning? Because for some people
Mm.
it is, or is it like, is this the luxury event? So they're willing to go all out and they have different kind of things that they're passionate about because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking like, Gabby, you said like selling an experience, right? Of like, are you greeted with a cocktail and all of these things? And I think that's what we're selling, right? Is like we want them to have a great experience, our guests to show up, have a great experience. And I think that's often feedback I even get at a wedding. Like guests come up to me and they're like, this has been so amazing. And I think that helps fuel how I provide my services. But I also think for each person, right, it's like different. Like some people value maybe the cocktail hour or like the initial touch point. I have a client right now who like wooden tables were very, very important to her. She wanted zero linens. And so I think it's really listening to each client of like, what is it for you that's like a touch point that feels really important? Like Emily, earlier when you asked, like early when I got married, I really wanted a coffee cart, like an espresso, like lattes, all of this stuff. And like that was important to me. But for some clients, they're like, I could care less if we even serve coffee, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's like really listening in to like what each client wants for their experience.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is like another piece of advice of like if you feel like you wouldn't spend money on this and like you're thinking about like the marketing and sales process, like a lot of sales coaches, I think one commonality and advice that they give is like kind of like shut up during sales calls. It's like after you say a price or like after you ask a question, just like close your mouth and like listen
That's
to what
so
they have to
hard.
say. And I feel like that's something that can be applied throughout the entire process of like when you ask them what's important, don't try to like throw all these options in their face of like, well, some clients do this with their linens and like some clients do this and like throwing all these options, like just like kind of pause and like actually hear what they have to say. Especially if you're working with like maybe a more introverted couple or like a couple dynamic where like one partner is like way more outspoken, like kind of listening to both sides and being like, what's important to you? And I think starting off the entire client experience with that from your first email to them is going to do you so much good throughout the process. And those are the kinds of things that I think you can also bring up later on. Like if there are like moments of tension or something, you can like bring them back to the present and be like, remember you said this part is really important to you. We're focusing on this part. Like we're not focusing on some of these other details because you said that wasn't important to you and like
Mhm.
kind of bringing it back to like a center strategy.
Hmm.
Because it can still be strategic with weddings too.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Emily, as we wrap up, we have just a couple more questions for you, but I would love to know if you can walk us through kind of maybe a small practical way that someone can really refine their client archetype this week. Like that doesn't require necessarily a whole rebrand or identity crisis or anything, but something they could do to start really thinking about how to target that ideal client archetype.
Yeah, I think one thing would be to like journal about like what's working well, what clients that you love to work with the most. Like pick 2 to 3 couples that you would book over and over again if you could. Like if you could just have every single weekend filled with them. Do that journaling practice, and then I would say put it into ChatGPT. I'm not like a full AI person for everything, but I think it
Sure.
can be really helpful to like write everything down that you know about those clients and then say like, hey, ChatGPT, like this is the kind of client that I love to work with. And then put in your website and say like, is my website speaking to this client right now?
Mm.
And that can be a good exercise to see that. And then I actually got this tip from Maria in a coaching call where it was like, then take like 5 to 10 other competitors and put them in and like ask like who they're targeting with their websites. And then you can get some like good kind of like table breakdown. Sometimes they'll even send like ChatGPT will send a whole table back of like, here's who you target, here's who they target, like pros and cons of each website. And you can get some clarity on like what are you actually communicating through your website that way.
Yeah, agreed. That's
I
great.
think it's a fun exercise too, like to kind of dive in and like get that like third person advice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unbiased. Well, I was gonna say unbiased opinion, although my chat is like my number one fan. So
Yeah. Might
Yeah,
be a
everything
little
I say
biased.
is
yeah.
golden.
Maybe you could also log out or do it like in an incognito window
True.
too.
Oh,
And
that's a
then
good idea.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
So maybe you could try it both ways too. I would be interested to see if it's different with like your anonymous ChatGPT
Yeah.
versus the one that's biased.
That's a
Oh,
great
that's
idea.
a
I
good
didn't
idea.
even think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I
So,
think that's the biggest one.
go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
Uh,
I was just gonna say I
I
think
was just
that's
gonna
the biggest
say, so kind of to wrap up, if a wedding pro remembers one thing about client archetypes from this episode, what do you want them to remember?
I think remember that it's ever evolving. Like it's not going to stay stagnant forever. Um, and it's kind of two, so it's cheating. I guess like remember that it's evolving just like your business and life and everything, like it can't stay stagnant. And then the other part is that when you do pick your client archetype, remember that everything is about them and you're always speaking to them and their values.
Mm.
It's not about like sharing your expertise or like your resume of qualities and skills. Like from there, like I mentioned, being a guide to your clients earlier, it's like you really have to learn to guide that client archetype through a process and give them that end result that they're really passionate about. So, like, take yourself out of the equation and remember that, like, you're always speaking to them and their needs and their like desires and everything. And I think that will help you make your marketing a lot easier.
Yeah.
Love that.
Amazing. Emily, this was such a good conversation. I
Yeah.
think it's really helpful, especially like in the beginning of the year, just like reevaluating where you're at if you do need to refine your client archetype. So I think this will be helpful for a lot of wedding pros. And Emily, how can people find you? How can they work with you? What services do you offer?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, both of you. I am emilyfostercreative.com for my website. You can reach out there. I also offer website audits, so that's something that you can reach out about. And then I'm Emily Foster Creative on Pinterest, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can shoot me a DM, ask me any questions about this. I'd love to hear from you.
And you will all be shocked and I think we did talk about it at the beginning of the episode, but that Emily is also part of the abundance group that I am in, as everybody on this podcast and on this earth now knows because I talk about it all the time. But we're both big fans. So if you want to join the abundance group and come hang out with us and the other creatives, that is also a place you can find both of us.
Yeah, I love the community so much. I was also going to mention I have a client archetype workbook, so I can send you the
Ooh.
link to that too, and it will have you answer some like more in-depth questions about your client archetype. I think it's my URL and then slash client archetype workbook with like dashes between the words, but I'll send that to you.
Great. Yeah, we'll add that to the show notes for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Well, thanks, Jabbers, for being here. And if you want, you can join us over on Substack. We release weekly blog posts there. And also, if you want to become a paid member, we also provide a bonus episode once a month to our paid subscribers. So thanks so much, Jabbers. And Emily, we love chatting with you, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.